Hi everyone, my name is Dr Nia Williams and welcome to my taster session on what makes a serial killer. So these are the learning outcomes for this very short lecture. First of all, we will look at what is the definition of a serial killer. Then we will look at various factors that might contribute into somebody developing to be a serial killer. And then finally we will look at what are those telltale signs that we should look out for during childhood. Okay, so let's start with the terminology. Now then, there's a difference between a serial killer and a mass murderer. Okay, so even though both might kill a lot of people, there are differences. So a mass murder is a one-off event. So if you think back a couple of years ago to the Manchester Arena bombing, yeah, that's what we call a mass murder. One-off events, killing a lot of people, and usually the perpetrator will die at the scene. They didn't die in that case. However, many of them will shoot themselves or kill themselves at the scene. Serial killer is different. To be classified as a serial killer, you will have needed to have killed 3 or more people. These are separate events, separate locations. And also for serial killers, we have what we call a cooling off period. Yeah, what this means is that a serial killer might kill a person and then they might not kill again for weeks, months, and in some cases years, which makes them really difficult then to catch. So when are they formed? Okay, now the average serial killer, they don't start killing until they're 29. That's the average age. Of course, some are sooner, some are later, but that's the average. However, many people argue that a serial killer is actually formed by the age of 5, and some question this and actually challenge and say, no, do you know what? They are formed by the age of 2. So these early years are critical. Why is this? It's all down to our brain development. You know, I'm sure you've heard the phrase, give me a child before 7 and I'll show you the man. What that means is that early years, that wiring that's happening in our brains during that early years provides us with that foundation of who we will be, who we will become when we are older. So that is critical. And we've kind of seen this in serial killers. Okay, so here's just an example of a few serial killers that we've seen over the years. And when you look at their early years, when you look at their environment and what they were exposed to in those early years, they were very traumatic. You know, there was physical abuse, sexual abuse, and all sorts of these things, which meant that these young children didn't have secure attachment. If you don't have secure attachment, you do not grow up in believing that the world is a safe place, yeah? And you can have healthy relationships with people. You can't because you don't trust anybody. So attachment theory, having poor attachment, has been linked to perpetrators' serial killing behaviour. Now, I'm not saying that everybody who has that difficult start in life will develop to become serial killers, but there is a correlation with many of the killers that we've seen and those early years. Then we've got, you know, your parents and how they are parenting. So these are 2 examples here. First of all, we've got Brian Blackwell. Now, Brian Blackwell isn't classified as a serial killer because he killed 2 people. He killed his mother and his father. But when you look at his upbringing, he had a very difficult childhood. You know, and his relationship with his mother wasn't a typical one. And what I mean here is he wasn't allowed to play. He wasn't allowed to have any friends. His mother would dress him in a way where you wouldn't expect a child of that age to dress. His mother also bathed him. And this was until later in his life, you know, 17, 18. So a very difficult relationship between him and his mother. And when he killed his mother, he actually took her body and placed it in the bath. So there was a very strong link there. Then you've got the Versace killer, who's at the bottom of the screen here. Now then, his upbringing was very different. He was put on this pedestal. He was praised. You know, he was this highly intelligent, little boy, and he was allowed to have the master bedroom in the house. You know, his parents adored him. And what we've seen when we're looking at the research and kind of parenting, how too much of this praise can actually be linked to a child developing narcissistic personality disorder, narcissistic traits. So we've got the attachments theory as one factor. We've also got toxic parents as another possible contributing factor. Then we've got children who are prone to accidents. So the swing accidents has also been linked to a couple of serial killers. There are a couple of examples on the screen for you there. Now, I'm not saying, again, that every child who has had an accident falling off the swing, as I'm sure we all did as children, is linked to you becoming a serial killer. But some people have kind of linked up with these accident-prone children and what impact these constant accidents have had on their brain development. So here's just more examples here of children who, especially Fred West was he had a few brain injuries. So the question is whether, you know, these accidents contributed to deficits in their brain development that possibly could have led to them developing serial killing behaviour. Then we've got DNA. Some people have just identified differences in chromosomes, and maybe that's linked. And then, of course, we've got the personality, you know, the psychopathy, psychopathic test, and traits. Now, I'm not saying that, again, every psychopath will become a serial killer. If you look at the work of the Godfather Robert Hare, you know, he said, if I wouldn't be studying psychopaths in prison, I'd be studying them in the stock markets and so forth. Psychopaths can be very, very successful. But there is a link with many of the serial killers that we've seen, and then them having psychopathy. Okay, so we've got all of those kind of possible contributing factors. Now, if you look at these, this graph and these statistics, you will see that from the 1960s and upwards to the 1980s, there was a huge peak in the number of serial killers that were operating. And if you think about, you know, why was that? What exactly was going on? You know, and if these serial killers don't actually develop that kind of behaviour until they're 29, what was going on before then? And when you look at these things, we've got two main things. I forgot that animation was there. Bear with me. Okay. First of all, we've got the Second World War. Yes, so many people went, many men went to war, and when they came back, you know, many were traumatized. They had post-traumatic stress disorder. Many turned to alcoholism. Many couldn't cope. Many were emotionally unavailable. Now, if you were a child living in that home and your father returned from Second World War and you know, had post-traumatic stress disorder and so forth, then that could have been a very difficult environment. You know, maybe these men returned home and were very physically abusive because they just couldn't cope. Many didn't know what to do, didn't have any jobs. So there's possible link with that environment that could have influenced that peak that we saw in that graph. And another reason, possible reason, is, you know, in 1929, the Wall Street crash and then the Great Depression and the impact that had, again, on families, you know, parents not being able to cope, men losing their jobs, not, again, similar to what we've just seen in the war, the aftermath of the Second World War. So that too might have impacted in these children's environments. And some people are arguing that after the 2008 crash that we saw, that we will see a possible rise in serial killing behaviour in the future as a result of that. So be careful. So finally, let's move on to what are the kind of telltale signs? What are the things to look out for in young children? Well, you've got, aggressive behaviour. You've got torturing animals. You've got spying, watching other people, voyeurism. You've got burning things. Burning gives you power. You can destroy things. And then finally, bedwetting, and that's again linked to your control. Many of these serial killers can't control their behaviours. And there we go, a quick whirlwind taster session on what makes a serial killer. Diolch yn fawr iawn am wrando. Thank you so much for listening.